Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast, where we demystify the creative process and exchange ideas with career-minded artists. We are your hosts, Adriana Amay and
Jackie Sanders. We're two emerging artists sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our journey. So if you're not already, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you will be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday.
So today we're really excited that we have a guest artist interview. I'm going to go through a quick introduction of Peter Marin, and then we'll dive right in. All right, so Peter was born and raised in Mexico City. He has lived in a lot of different cities like San Francisco, Oakland, Madrid, New York City, and now Raleigh. He received a BA from UC Berkeley and an MFA from Hunter College. He has been painting for over 30 years and exhibits both nationally and internationally. His work is part of public and private collections. He's represented by Charlotte Russell Contemporary Gallery at this time. Marin has 23 years of art teaching experience with various populations, from teens to graduate students. He currently teaches as an adjunct assistant professor at Wake Tech Community College and Living Arts College. And as a teaching artist, he works with various art institutions, including the North Carolina Museum of Art. In addition, he also offers various professional services, including consultation, curation, and education programming, and his studio is currently at Art Space in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to the podcast, Peter. I tried to shorten obviously over the last 30 years, there's a lot you've done, so I tried to shorten it a little bit and give us the concise version, but you've done a lot, so we are really, really excited to have you on the podcast.
Well, I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for taking time and energy to create the podcast and to invite me to participate. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Of course. And we are so excited to talk to you today, just to talk more about your style and how you've become an artist. But if people are not familiar with your work, how would you describe your work to someone who hasn't seen it before?
Well, I would describe it as a playful use of basic geometric shapes, and also a playful use of color.
Nice. Yeah, that's how I would describe your work as well. A lot of crisp, hard edges as well.
Yes. I am very much focused on the nature of the forms that I use. And so rather than to suggest them and be expressive with them, I want to be as literal as I can. So the hard edge and the defined form are central to how I work.
For those of you that may be just listening and maybe they're driving in the car, forgive me for oversimplifying it, but essentially it's a lot of geometric shapes, a lot of what looks like triangles in a whole lot of different colors, and then the way they're placed together. Sometimes it even has kind of a 3D effect going on. It's really, really cool. And then in terms of how we met, obviously the three of us have studios over at Art Space in downtown Raleigh. So I think this is when we first came in contact with your work, I believe.
It is. Being in the same building together has supported us to come into contact with each other and be able to endeavor projects such as this one. So our crossing paths is as a result of being Art Space tenants.
Yeah, and I feel like it was such an interesting time. I know Adriana and I moved in July of 2020. When did you move into Art Space?
I moved in February of 2020.
Okay.
So I had the luck of having the last first Friday.
Oh man, you're like one and done. They were like, "Hey, you had your one. Now let's shut down for a while. Give you some time." Right. Yeah, and that was such an interesting time, as we've talked about on the podcast before. Of obviously, we loved having our studios there, but then there wasn't much socializing or networking, which is such an amazing part of the art space community that it brings, of being neighbors with artists, but we still couldn't like socialize or interact. So I know, especially seeing your artwork through your studio window, of course, people know I'm a geometric artist as well. And so I've always been gravitated towards your work. So kind of like looking from afar. So I'm glad that we can finally visit each other's studios and talk when we're in the hallway and not just have to like shuffle by wearing our masks.
Right.
But I've always been curious, did you always know that you wanted to be an artist? And like, how did that beginning of your journey look like?
You know, it's a very interesting question, and thank you for asking it. I was, in a sense, raised to be an artist. My father, who is an architect, had his interest and his hands in a myriad of arts in Mexico. And so as a child, I spent a lot of my time going to artist studios, to ceramic studios, to brick making uh, furnaces, to glass making places, to iron, you name it.
Cool. Yeah.
Mexico has a rich tradition of art, and not just necessarily the fine arts, but the manual arts, or what we call artesanías. And so it was always a way of getting to know Mexico through the arts. And in addition to that, I was always taken to museums and taken to galleries and taken to artist studios. So I spent a great deal of my youth running around in these places, at the time not knowing what an impact it would have with my life. But as you can see, my house is full of art as well. I've sort of that tradition. And so art has been central to my reality since I was a child. And I have my father to thank for that. So the process of becoming an artist, in retrospect, really began when I was very, very young.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's so cool thinking back on those experiences. I think as like adults, we then reflect back on what are those beginning influences. And of course, you don't know anything besides what you know as a kid. So you just assume this is probably what all families do in their free time,
Correct.
go to museums, rather than doing some other things. And so it's cool then those seeds being planted so early that it kind of just became that seamless path for you.
Right. And even to this day, when I do see my father, our primary activity is to go see art, go see other people's work, go to the museum, go to the art spaces and the art creative hubs, and see what's going on. So even today, it is our primary activity, and we enjoy it very much.
Oh, that's amazing. Especially I think for like any group of people, it's awesome having those creative hubs is they just like lend their platform to have such amazing conversations, those bonding moments and bringing up new ideas. And rather than just the same old restaurant or the same old activity, there's always something new and new ideas to explore.
Right.
Yeah.
Additionally, since he's an architect, that also made a strong impression on me. And it's one of the reasons why I work geometrically nowadays.
Yeah.
It is that the activity of an architect really is principally engaged in the 2 dimensions with geometry. It is then carried out in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
But early on, my dad would say, whatever you do, don't become an architect. And since the bulk of our time together was spent with painters and in museums and things of that nature, I took his advice and did not pursue architecture. But really, this was a decision that I made for myself, but it was one that had many miles on it to do so.
Yeah. Peter, it's so funny that you say that because just a quick connection point. Again, I know earlier we talked about how I work in geometric work. There are so many parallels between our story. So because my parents own their own architecture firm, grew up going to museums, we'd always joke because on family vacations, we'd go to like Frank Lloyd Wright houses and we'd go to these cities and like go on architecture tours. And so my dad and I had literally the same conversation when I was in high school because I loved math and I love the arts. So I was like, oh, I'll go into architecture. And my dad was like, please do not become an architect. And he's like, just be an art major, do what you love, be an art major, which is like not the normal conversation with parents. Normally they're like, we need something quote unquote dependable and stable. And he's like, no, do not do that. Don't be an architect, be an artist. It's what you're meant for. And so the parallels between that is crazy. Aside from the geometric influence, I always joke that in addition to having coloring books, I also grew up like sketching with rulers and T-squares because that's where I was on this drafting table next to my dad. He was doing all the drawings by hand before computers. And the Prismacolor pencils I use in my studio are like the old ones that they used to do when doing building renderings.
Right.
So when they converted to computers in like the early 2000s, there's like a reason I don't have any like greens and blues of color pencils because they always had to draw the grass and the sky on their building renderings. Right. So like they use like all the other colors. And she's like, do you want these Prismacolors? And I'm like, yes. Are you kidding? It was like the big 500 pencil box. And I'm like, this is amazing. And still using them to this day.
I love how, without them knowing or not, our parents, for all three of us, had such a giant influence. Mine was not so much my parents, it was more my grandparents, my grandpa specifically, because he used to do printmaking, lithographs, like etching, all that stuff, and then eventually did his own business and had all the supplies and whatnot. But just like you guys, it's like I was just a small kid, and it's like, well, we have these sample Prismacolors. Do you want any? It's like, yes. We have these sample paints and things we used to demo. They're leftover. Do you want them? Yeah, absolutely. So I love how those things, whether they necessarily wanted us or not to be artists when we grew up directly, it definitely led us in a way towards that path. And then it eventually led us to develop, styles and techniques that, perhaps reflect some of that narrative from our past. But with that said, of course, all that can influence us as much as it's going to, but we get to decide as artists how much of that we show through. So with that in mind, Peter, what would you say inspires the work that you make?
That's a very interesting question. The idea of inspiration. I've given it a lot of thought. I've given it thought enough to be able to introduce that idea into many of my coursework for my students. This idea of inspiration, and I really inspiration was a very like foggy idea to me, because I didn't understand this, the translating of an experience, of a conventional experience, for example, of going to see the sunset. And as a source of inspiration, for me, it just represented witnessing something, but not necessarily an impetus to produce something. And so I really gave it a lot of thought. I gave it a lot of research. And the best thing that I can come up with, it was actually found in some of Agnes Martin's writings. Agnes Martin, it says that inspiration is it's a process that is abundant in children, and that kids don't need external influences to become invested in their own interests. They just pursue what they want to, because inspiration is self-generated. Mm-hmm. So inspiration is not really external, but rather internal. And so this made a lot of sense to me, because I was trying to find out, like, why am I not getting inspired by looking at the palm trees or at the mountains? Why don't I want to go paint when I go, to see snow? But why do I want to paint when I see paints or when I'm in my studio? And so it really became clear that inspiration is an internal action. That inspiration is what we do as a result of doing our own sort of leads. And so inspiration for me since has always been really understood as an internal process, never an external process. And this was very interesting, because it kind of freed me up from the expectation of having to connect to my experiences, let's say travel, and have those experiences lead to the idea of making work based on those experiences. And it freed me from attaching external experiences to my work. And it really allowed me to pursue my internal interests as the source of inspiration. Now, just to sort of conclude, and again, going back to Agnes Martin made it very clear as well. I mean, I would recommend reading her to come to terms to understand this. Having a child, I see that my child becomes her own lead. She starts playing out of nothing. She takes things and makes some things. And so really that is the function of the artist, is to take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. And so how's the child doing this? Agnes Martin really put it very succinctly. She says, you can put a flower in front of the artist, and then you can take the flower away, but the artist already knows that the flower is beautiful, because the artist knows that the beauty is not resident on the flower, but rather inside. Mm-hmm. So I don't need to see the flower to know that it's beautiful. So I don't need the external to understand that what's internal is what's creating the capacity to create.
Oh my goodness. I love all of that. I love all of that. Especially, I'm going to have to check out Agnes Martin's writing, because clearly just from the way that you talk about it, it's such an impactful part of your process. And I love the part that you were saying about the external versus internal motivation, because that's so much, I feel like, what artists battle with is inspiration or motivation, or the difference between the two and what you feel compelled to create. And so I'm curious how that affects your creative process, whether logistically of like when you create or how then you decide to work within geometric forms, how that idea affects your creative process.
Right. So I teach from a place of experience. So whenever I teach my students, I'm teaching them not what I've learned about others, but what I've learned about myself with the process. And one of the things I teach my students all the time is that we as artists have two principal roles: to make problems and then to solve problems. And so the work itself, when I begin, is a blank canvas. So there is no problem. We're neutral. And so the moment I start working on it, I start creating problems, which then I have to solve. And so the work itself is a solving of the problems that I'm creating at the same time. It's a destruction and a construction at the same time. And so rather than being overwhelmed by a blank surface, for example, a blank surface only means that we have a job to do, which is to disrupt it. But once disrupted, we have to mend it again. And it is that disruption and that mending is the basis of sort of the logic of how I work, and the basis of the logic of what I teach to my students.
I absolutely love that because, I mean, for some folks, I'm just going to go out there and say it. When I look at the smooth surfaces of your paintings, I don't necessarily see a deconstruction before reconstruction, as opposed to other artists. And I'm going to put myself in this camp. I make it obvious that there is I actually mess up the surface of my canvas with a lot of texture and a lot of random marks on purpose to show the deconstruction as an obvious stage of the process, right? And reflect some of the history that comes through the layers, and then what happens on top never covers fully what's under. So I love the parallels of the creative process. Yes, on the surface, especially from a tactile perspective, they may be looking different, but the parallels are there. We're doing the same thing. We are doing, disruption, and then, putting our own message on top. And then also echoing what you said earlier about inspiration. You also don't just sit there and wait. You actually get to work. You're using the internal to fuel what is visible on the external, right, if you will, but you're translating things you're seeing, feelings, experiences, not, I have to note, of course, as I say this, for those folks that maybe they're listening for the first time, all three of us do work abstractly. So we are not trying to render a painting just like we see it in a photo or an actual, right, scene in front of us where it's more of a technical detail. We're actually translating things, if you will. I think, right, at least that's the way I think about them. We're transforming different feelings, energies, memories, and we're translating them into the canvas, which surprisingly, even though all three of us work abstract, never ceases to amaze when somebody looks at the finished painting and can actually, in a way, receive, this sounds kind of rude, but it's not, they can almost read what we were trying to transmit through it without even seeing a title or even knowing what we intended to say through it, but almost like they can read it. And that never ceases to amaze me. But before I go down that rabbit hole, because I'm like really excited, I love talking about the creative process, of course. Question that a lot of artists probably come up with. It's definitely the part of the creative process that many of us sometimes find ourselves a little bit of a struggle in is, how do you know when it's done? Yes, you have your message, you're transmitting it. How do you know when it's done?
I get that question often by students, and I have a definite point where I know where it's done, and it comes as a result of practice. But usually, there's a type of reconciliation that happens at the end of the exercise of making a painting. I could not imagine having that be an open-ended situation. It would drive me nuts. Part of the thing that we do when we make artwork is we seek reconciliation. We seek an end to that experience, just as we do with anything else in our lives. When do we know that we're full from eating? We're eating to get to that point, but we know when we get to that point. In a way, making art is the same way. Is that the problems that we are solving become solved, and experience teaches one when you've arrived at that point where the work can be its own. Now, can we go back and work the work? Sure, we can, and many artists do. But for me, it's much more important to be able to put the work to rest and take that impetus into the new. And so whatever I feel might be left open or might not be resolved, I allow that to be part of the problematic of the work. And rather than taking the opportunity to come to terms with that on the work, I bring that to the next work. And it brings me to another idea that I rely on heavily, and that art needs art. And so one painting produces the need for the next. And it is that need that comes with knowing when the other painting is done and what you need to do with in the next work. Now, my paintings take a long time to make. There have been paintings that have taken me up to 300 hours to make. And so it argue that like, well, I really didn't know when I was going to be done because I've been vacillating for 300 hours. But the process is the process. It just comes to a point where like you just have to move on to the next work, but not abandon what you've done before. But this idea of reconciliation, you've come to solve the problems you created, and they're solved. It is probably best to just, if you're struggling with that, just put it down and start a new painting. I think spending too much time on that point can actually be antithetical to the process. It can bring on a type of self-destruction. So my advice to my students is when they ask this question, I say, well, if you're struggling with that, maybe that's the moment that you need to say, I'm done with this and I'm time to move on. All paintings don't need to be resolved. We're not making products, we're making our work. And it's not like you're not addressing the problems or the issues of the work. It's just that the energy to do so and the time to do so is now to focus on what lies ahead rather than be stuck on this issue. So again, I think the end of a painting varies greatly with a lot of people, but also it seems that a lot of the work today is made almost with the end in sight as well. That the process of many artists is leading to a final thing rather than an open-ended question. And so again, I know already from experience, even up to like the amount of time it requires to finish a painting, when my paintings will be done.
Nice. That is really cool.
I love that. And I love the idea of, it's almost, I mean, so much of art brings up conversations about life. And so it's almost, when thinking about any problem in your day-to-day life, relationship wise or otherwise, it's not everything goes perfectly as planned. Not everything is tied up with a perfect bow. Sometimes it's left messy and unresolved. And that's, with time and insight, can kind of make it what it makes it beautiful. And so I think that's an awesome perspective to have with your paintings too. And I loved how you were saying how like one painting informs and leads to the next too. It's this like ever evolving journey. There's not necessarily a destination that you're shooting for. It's just part of the process is exploring, posing these questions, and then sitting with them.
Yeah,
Right.
that has a parallel with the idea of, if you look at the paintings themselves, like the whole body of work, almost like a journey, then the open-ended question could be, why am I drawn to this? What is it about this process? What is it about the message that I'm trying to portray? What do I still need to say about this message? And then almost treating it like a carry through. So, okay, I said what I could on this one. There's so much more I want to say. The lessons learned on this one. It goes to the next, and then the next. And then it just almost like the evolution continues with every piece. But that question, like you said, it's open-ended. So it just continues. Sometimes more questions arise. Some of them get answered, but it just, I don't know. This is the motion I'm thinking of. People can't see this unless they're watching the YouTube. It's like the rolling motion, right?
Right.
Which actually leads me to a question. You mentioned, we said it at the bio, of course, and then you mentioned it just here recently, that these are some of the lessons that you've learned, which we love that because we're all about sharing forward as well. But you mentioned you share some of these lessons, some of these maxims or guidelines, if you will, with your students. What led you into going beyond, say, sharing these things with fellow artists, just casually, right? Colleagues, and instead actually taking some students in and saying, all right, sit down. You may be in different stages of your artist career, maybe some really newbies. Let's dig in. Like, how did you get into teaching art?
Well, I knew I wanted to teach art the moment I got to college, to my undergraduate. It didn't take me long to make a declaration as to my major. It took me a day. So I wasn't going to do anything else. I just felt I was very prepared to do what I'm doing. And it just seemed a logical step for me. And having my first class, I said, "Oh wow, this is what I want. Like, what a great opportunity to be involved in doing what you love." And so teaching uh, was something that I started thinking about um, because many of my mentors were so effective in being able to coach, to influence, to suggest, to challenge, to be critical with me in a very productive way. And so my understanding of how art is made, my experience with it, coupled with this desire to help others with it as I've been helped, was a pretty simple thing to arrive at.
Nice.
So I decided at that moment, I think it was like day 3, that I needed to get a terminal degree in the practice of art, and so that's why I went with my MFA, so I could have the credentials to then continue teaching. Now, when it comes to students versus fellow artists, I have to be very careful because students make a commitment to me to seek guidance and assistance from me. They have committed to accept what I'm saying and draw their own conclusions. And they've accepted to receive help based on the questions they might have. Whereas fellow artists, I just don't feel like I have any business telling them what to do. That's their job.
Yeah.
And so if I'm asked to give my opinion on their work, I will, but I don't think it's effective. I don't think it's warranted. I don't think it's necessary. And I don't think it's part of the dynamic to take on the role of teacher when I'm talking to artists who have their own practices and who are not students.
Yeah,
I can give my advice, or I can give my view on something that somebody's made. And for example, this weekend I went around all the galleries and all the studios, and at Anchor Light, I saw some people's work that I just expressed my opinion on, and that were very I think very moved or very flattered or very encouraged by this. But by no means was I there giving them a directive or anything of that matter. And so it's very important for me to draw a distinction between those who are signing up to have my help versus those people who are my peers and who have done all that work on themselves.
Yeah, I think that's such a great observation to share with fellow artists, because I think especially coming from the more academia type world, that is one thing that I definitely learned very early on. You're kind of forced into these like group critiques and getting feedback on your work. And as an artist, you realize how impactful other people's perspectives or interpretations of your work can be on your own relationship with your work, whether you like to say that you have a tough skin or not. It does affect people's observations, what they see, what their interpretations are. It can affect your view of your own work in a good or a bad way. And so I think especially understanding the difference between, okay, students are signing up to get constructive criticism, to be taught, to learn, versus a fellow artist where maybe not that in a negative way, they don't want your opinion, but maybe they're in the middle of those unresolved questions, like you were talking about earlier. And part of their process is getting through those questions on their own without outside influences.
It's important also for us artists, when we're looking at somebody else's work, which has nothing to do with ours, to get involved in their work, not as we would want it, but as the artist has it. Mm-hmm. And try to understand the work from that perspective, not from the perspective of what you would do, but from the perspective of what that person is doing.
Yeah,
I think it's important responsibility of us artists to also be able to engage with artwork, not based on what we do, but based on what other people are doing, and to try to understand what it is that they're doing, the logic, the solutions, the problems, the issues, independent of what we might think.
And of what we might like.
Exactly.
Because that can be hard too. It's like that fine line of, okay, maybe I don't like what this person has produced, especially when you're looking at a group show. It's very easy to say, I like that, I don't like that. Ugh, what is that? But to actually go past that superficial, that surface level, and say, okay, what were they trying to say? And I think all three of us at some point or another, we've done jurying of some sort of shows. So we have to go through that too, which is of course another level, another rabbit hole, but go through that process to say, okay, what were they trying to communicate, and were they effective in communicating it, even if the
Right.
style is not necessarily what I like? And also being open to say, okay, maybe it's not really my jam, but actually I really liked how they did that. Could some of that perhaps be something that informs something I do in the future? Like I
Yeah.
didn't think of that. That was great. Like I didn't like the painting, but there's this one thing they did that's really cool. And then being able to take that back without necessarily putting anybody down.
Right. Right. I mean, criticism is ineffective. Criticism in terms of like, I like this, I don't like this, to the person who made it. But again, as I teach my students, and we have a lot of critics. Well, this is the bulk of what we do. Is that we meet to be critical about our work, not to criticize it. And I want to draw that distinction that we have the wrong word for the right activity. They're not critiques, they're criticalities. Let's get together and be critical about what we're doing and understand what we're doing so we can benefit from that critical aspect rather than getting together and saying, I like, I don't like. Because art is not really something that we do to produce things that we like or don't like. We're embedded in it. So it's much more complex than just an aesthetic experience.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I feel like that's probably such a pivotal mindset shift for your students, is hearing that difference. And so I'm curious, as a professor and a teacher to so many different students, what is your favorite thing, if you had to pick, about teaching? And what do you find is the most difficult part of teaching?
Well, my favorite thing has always been to see my students grow. And the most difficult is always trying to get my students to unlearn all of the bad ideas they have about art. It's difficult to teach the student that has made something that what they have made is the only thing that they can work on, and that what they have made and what they wish they have made are two different things, and one of them does not exist. The beginning student or the developing student always makes something but wishes it were something else, and that is one of the difficult things that I find prevalent in teaching. The other thing, and this is not at all a commentary on anybody practicing realism, but that art is so much more than engaging in realism. And that realism is by no means the standard of measure to creating successful work.
Not anymore.
And so being able to inculcate the student into different ways of thinking other than it looks like a picture, that's a real challenge, and it's a regular challenge, but it's one that I see as having a responsibility to shift. So it's not something I dislike, it's just a real challenge in the teaching practice.
Yeah, I like that. So with that, obviously, again, you're talking to a lot of different students. There's a lot to process there. I hope some of it you can leave in the classroom instead of taking home and worry about like, oh, this person's really stuck in their ways. Because honestly, there's not much we can do about that
Yeah,
for the most part. But that sounds like a lot to take on, right? And it's a lot you're imparting forward. You know how we talked about a little bit ago how a lot of our experiences and things can come through our art. What I'm curious about is, do those things kind of infiltrate in your art and then perhaps like mess up the balance of that time for you to make your art versus like preparing for classes? Like, do they kind of blend into each other, or how does that work for you?
they don't. The problematics in the classroom, the issues that come up that are inherent in the teaching environment, are are part of the teaching environment. My solutions to those problems come from my own experience of having to ask myself those very questions. When I was early on, like people would say, well, what's this abstraction stuff? Like, you should be painting like Diego Rivera or Frida Kahlo, like realism. And I had to understand what those things meant, what they were really saying. that there was a skill level to be attained and a certain way of acquisition of knowledge before you could divulge anything else. And so my experience is my guide. I've been doing this for such a long time that I see now the problems that we're discussing as almost commonplace, and my responsibility as an instructor, as a professor, as a teacher, to be able to guide the student out of that assumption and guide them into a place where they can gain control over their critical thinking.
Okay.
And so for me, keeping up my own standards, my own practice, and my own experiences is what's important. If anything, I'm guided by keeping true to what I'm saying and walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Yeah. And I think that's so important with being a successful teacher and mentor. Like you're saying, you having those influences early on in your creative development through mentors of your own, and realizing how important and powerful that can be for your students. That's almost making you a better teacher, or it is making you a better teacher by being right in the thick of the creative process with them, with your own work. So I'm curious, how many classes do you normally teach? Are there a certain number a month or a semester? And what fun classes do you have coming up?
The amount of classes change because for the most part, I teach the bulk of the courses are offered in 6-week courses. So I can be teaching at any given point anywhere between 6 to 10 classes a week. But I am involved. It's what I want to do outside of my own practice of painting is teach painting. So it is a lot. It takes a lot of energy, but it is. I feel very comfortable there. During the pandemic, I had the opportunity to develop coursework. And I've written over 40 courses, ranging in a wide number of topics. I do the conventional introduction classes. I also offer genre classes. I offer theory classes. I offer formal classes, and I offer critical thinking classes. I currently have a class that I'm offering called Contemporary Tendencies, where we are looking at particular contemporary tendencies that are guiding artwork rather than contemporary practices. And so, for example, one of the ideas that we're looking at is places and spaces. And so let's look at artists that are dealing with this in a variety of ways that are not the conventional ways. So we can expand our notion of what these ideas might mean with the intention of informing our own work.
Nice.
So that would be an example of current classes. And classes that I'm going to be teaching soon, I'm teaching a class at the museum starting May 27th. I encourage all of you to sign up for it. It's called Art of the Landscape. And it's an in-person class. It's a 6-week course, so 6 classes. 2 of the classes take place at the museum. And so Art of the Landscape, I've designed it to be concurrent with their exhibition Fault Lines. And so I want us to examine how artists have dealt with the idea of the landscape as a vessel for colonialism, as a vessel for environmentalism, as a vessel for idealism, and how all these ideas and all these perspectives are embedded in the very use of landscape, whether it's the environment as we were seeing it now, or whether it was the Dutch landscape of the 17th century. And by using the museum's collection and the museum's exhibition, we take these first accounts of the work and we make them our resources to produce work that is in critical reaction or in critical addition to the ideas of the environment.
That's perfect. And I believe then for our listeners, when this episode is released, if you're hearing this real time on the 17th, you may still have time, depending how many seats are available, to sign on. We will obviously have a link to that in the show notes. But before we go further,
I also wanted to, since I've had the opportunity, I'm sorry to interrupt, I also teach privately, and I would encourage all of you to sign up with some classes that I teach privately. Classes that I offer regularly are critical thinking courses. I try to change them, but I offer a class called Color as Communication, and it's a color theory class for painters. And I also offer a regular class, Advanced Painting, which is a great community. I've had people in my class, my advanced painting class now for 6 years. So it is a very strong community of like-minded individuals who gather on a weekly basis to discuss what it is that's going on in their studios to strengthen their practice and strengthen their vision.
That's perfect. And then when we release this, I believe the submission deadline for Bada Bada would have already passed. And I'd like to check with you. I know you also have your debut curatorial exhibition that's on display, but I wanted to check with you the dates on when the Bada Bada exhibition will be on display at Diamante. And then, of course, you have another exhibition that you just put up and see, the 17th, which is when this goes live. So which one will be active at the time?
Right. I'm currently in a two-person show at Charlotte Russell Contemporary, who's my gallerist here in town in Raleigh, and it's called Proximity. I am exhibiting with a colleague of mine, Kelly Shepard Murray, and our work is connected by the use of color, but they're totally antagonistic mediums, if you will. Hers is sculptural and visceral and tactile, and mine is absent of all those things. It's flat, is markless, it's without texture, but we're unified by color. And so you're able to see not only the range of media, but also the capacity of different media to address similar issues, in this case, color and structure. The Bada Bada sale is an opportunity for artists. It's a project that I've designed as a fundraiser for Diamante Arts Cultural Center. And it is a fundraiser where I'm inviting artists to submit up to 5 works for a 3-day salon-style sale event. And the artist submits 5 works. Bada bada means affordable or cheap in street slang, Spanish street slang. And so I don't want the work to exceed more than $500. This makes it affordable to the people who might show up and want to buy artwork for their own home. The artist also sets their own commission. And so we have a sliding scale between 20% and 100%. And this is a reaction to a lot of fundraising actions that I've seen in the past where artists just donate their work and don't get anything for it. I myself, I don't think that is, I don't think that that's good. It's good for everyone except the artist, and yet the artist is what's allowing the funding to take place. And so I want the artist to be able to be the recipient of the money that they think they should be getting for the sale of their work. And so with that in mind, I'm inviting everybody to submit. I don't know if it will make it out in time, but that's the premise of the exhibition. You can find out that this sale exhibition will happen again next year, as it's an annual fundraiser. And I'm hoping to gather a lot of steam with it. Because it is just a 3-day opportunity for artists to sell work at price points that the public can afford, and also an opportunity for artists to get together, which is crucial.
When is the reception for that one?
The reception for Bada Bada is May 20th from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Again, it's a Friday, so if you're going to go out to dinner, you can go out to dinner and then come by and check out the work and hopefully buy something. And I've been able to secure commitments from a wide ranging of very sought after artists, members of our community who have been very generous in giving up their time and putting their works on for sale. So if you are looking for artwork and also are thinking about price points, this might be a good time to acquire very, very, I think, desirable and high-end work from practicing artists in our community without having to, pull money out of your 401k.
Yeah, it's a great time to start your art collection. I always talk about it's never too late, and there's never a piece too small to start your art collection. Just a little piece at a time and upgrading size as you can go. But it's such an amazing, rewarding experience to have a local artist's work in your home.
It's also important to know that when you spend money on an artist, you are helping them directly.
Yeah.
So he or she will be the direct beneficiary of that support. We have studios to pay, we have materials to pay, we have children to raise, we have bills to attend. And so making art is very expensive. And we are committed to making art. And so when you buy artwork, there is no middle person. You are directly helping somebody in the continuation of their practice. And I think that this needs to be we need to remind people this because our consumer culture is mediated by so many middlemen or middle women, if you will. You buy something and the distributor gets something, the shipper gets something, the retail place gets something, the state gets something, the government gets something.
Yeah.
When you buy from an artist, you're buying their work directly, and this is very important. And so you're allowing the artist to continue that practice. The percentage of the sale that the artist decides to give in commission goes directly to Diamante, which is a nonprofit, and it goes directly into programming, and programming that is, for the most part, often free to the public and necessary to the public.
Yeah, that is absolutely amazing. And so I hope so many people are able to participate in that program. And it's such an exciting opportunity, both for the artist and for that programming as well. So I'm super excited to go and participate in it, as well as go to the opening of it too.
I should say, although it is benefiting a Latino arts community or nonprofit, that this is open to everyone.
Awesome. Good distinction.
So it's very important that this is not exclusive, this is inclusive. And we know that we need better representation out there. So our inclusivity is a vote for representation as well.
Love that. I absolutely love that. Real quick, before we wrap things up, we do have 3 questions that we like to ask all of the artists who are on our podcast. So how would you define success as an artist?
Well, we could be funny about it and just say that I'm still doing it. Something must have been right.
Decades later.
Something I'm very, very weary about is I never recommend to anybody to become an artist. I think becoming an artist is a highly personal decision. And I think with highly personal decisions, success is built into them because you have a type of drive to make that happen. And so success really is, when it comes to the arts, it's not really like how famous you are or how much you sell, but is how content you are with what you're doing, how effective you are in your participation, how responsible you are to the community, how diligent you are about your discipline. And so success can be measured in a variety of metrics, not necessarily monetary ones, but success is I think, a standard of measure that oftentimes when it comes to art is really sort of messy. Success can be, making work every day, but never selling work. Or success can be making work every day and selling it. Success can be being disciplined to make space for your art as part of your way of living. And so success is kind of a slippery thing to try to hold on to or to measure yourself against. But I think if you've committed yourself to the practice of art, I think that in itself is an act of success.
I love that. And I feel like, in a way, to add to that just a little bit, it would be to look at your own trajectory to really measure what your success looks like based on how you're defining it. So it's not looking at how much are others selling, what are the other ones doing, how many paintings are they producing. It's more like you look at what you set out to do and how well do you do it. And like you said, you're content with it, but you're only comparing against yourself at that point and kind of like your own evolution. So absolutely love that. Obviously, everyone has a different, measure for success, like you mentioned. But I do want to ask you, so what is one piece of advice that you wish you had heard before you got started on your creative journey as it relates to this conversation, more on your professional journey?
I think I would have benefited from being encouraged to seek connections with other artists and not see other artists, and this is early on, it's not the case now, not see other artists as competition. I think, again, our society pits us against each other, especially when we're starting, and you're always comparing where you are to others. I think that that's just such a detrimental thing. And early on, in order to compete, in order to become, in order to be able to establish yourself, you do end up, as a standard practice, I think, sometimes competing. I think if I could go back and talk to my younger self, I would say instead of competing, collaborate,
Mm-hmm.
expand the network, not narrow the network. It took me a while to understand that, and now I fully use that as a guide. I am very much invested in making sure that I am connected to my community.
That's perfect because Jackie and I are huge on community over competition, sharing forward what we've learned, plus the thing that we've learned. And it's definitely reinforced by the place where the three of us have studios, where we are in a building full of artist studios, is that realization of it's not really a neck to neck competition. This is not a race. We're all in our own tracks anyways. We're not in the same track. There's no award at the end or anything. And instead, it's through those connections that not only can we help each other out when we're going through a tough time, which we all do, like, oh, this exhibition bombed, this person said they were going to buy this painting and then backed out, like whatever the case may be, my square isn't working. Can I borrow this? I need tape. Whatever it is, it's also that sense of like, no, we're all moving forward at our own speed in our own trajectories, but there's no reason to not work with each other and help each other forward. Because also at the end of the day, besides good karma, if you want to call it that, it's also the idea of these networks, you never know who knows who knows who knows who. And building that good credit, if you want to call it that, means that perhaps I have an opportunity that comes my way that needs 4 artists. Well, I'm just one. Then I may say, Jackie, Peter, I have this thing that came up. Do you want in? Right?
Yeah.
Jackie helped me with this. Peter helped me with that. Like, why wouldn't I ask them? It's not a competition of like, it's just mine and that's the end of it. They've been generous with me. Now I have something that I can give back. And I feel like that is such a much more fulfilling way to go through your trajectory instead of, and just shatter that notion of artists alone in their studios, competing against everybody, just being by themselves, frustrated, hitting their head against the wall, when sometimes all you need to do is talk it out with another artist who knows exactly what you're going through because they've gone through it too. I mean, like, oh, I had that on loop in my head and it was completely unnecessary. So yeah, absolutely love that.
I'd also like to add that if I could give advice, is that once you realize you're an artist, if you're not doing anything that day, you're still an artist. If you've done a lot that day, you're still an artist. If you haven't been in the studio for a month, you're still an artist. Because what an artist does is not only in the practice of their work, it's in the participation of life. You are an artist, so everything you do is related to your work, always. So even if you're not in the studio producing, if you're at home watching Netflix, you are still an artist. And so we have to be kind to who we are. We have to put this expectation of production. We have responsibility, sure, but it's not only when we're producing that we're artists. We're producing when we're sleeping. We're producing in the morning, at night. We're always looking at the world through that lens. And we're always informing ourselves and reminding ourselves that we're an artist. So my advice is to adopt a view that whatever you do is in the service of your art.
Definitely agree with that. We talk about that a lot on the podcast. Is my perspective, it's almost like quality control for my artwork. Like sometimes there are phases where your personal life commitments or other obligations pull you away from studio time or production of artwork, but those things are equally as important to your creative process as making the artwork itself. It's that those experiences, those influences that fuel your work. So it's not in combat with your creative process. It's part of it. And taking care of those things and taking care of your body and your mental health and your physical health, that's part of making good artwork too. Yeah.
Precisely.
Exactly. So real quick before we wrap up, a more lighthearted, fun question. If you had an extra $100 right now that you could use to invest in something that brings you joy, that's related to your art or your art business, what would you splurge it on or invest it in?
Well, I have a couple answers. If I had an extra $100, I would go to Bara Bara and find something for $100 and add it to my collection.
Of course.
Love it. Love it.
If I had another choice, I would go to the art store and buy $100 worth of tape. And if that weren't the case, I would, well, I mean, it's just art supplies or purchasing art. I just spent $100 on having my lawn mowed and everything. So maybe just going to bring calm and restoration to the property so I can produce without thinking, oh my God, my grass is getting so long.
I love that. And if anyone has been to Peter's studio or seen his work on social media, they know about your infamous paint wall that everyone talks about that has tape all over it. And it's like a work of art in itself. I'll let people look at your Instagram to get a taste of that. Or if they're in Raleigh and want to come to your studio, they can check it out in person.
By all means. Yeah, tape is crucial. I can always use more tape.
Yeah, never too many rolls of tape.
Never, 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 never.
Tape donations, you can drop them off. I'm kidding.
Hey, we're not kidding.
Hey, yeah. Hey, tape is the thing. Well, Peter, it has been delightful to have you on the podcast. You've dropped so many advice gems. It's not even funny. I do think some of the professor in you, of course, showed, and we are all to benefit from it. So thank you so much for being so generous, sharing your experiences and sharing the things that have helped you throughout your trajectory. I mean, that's just gold, lots of gold in there, lots of things where it's like, ooh, that's, if I had a highlighter, I'd be highlighting right now. But with that, we'll go ahead and wrap our conversation. For our listeners, please take a moment to let us know what you think about this episode, and perhaps just drop some 5 stars in your favorite podcast app. That will help us with getting this information, this interview, and all this wonderful information we shared onto more creatives so they can listen too.
Well, Jackie, Adriana, thank you so much for, again, for making this happen. If others are benefiting from your endeavors to bring this type of clarity and this type of information, it's an honor and a privilege to participate in it. And as I always tell my students, art needs art, and art is the way of the walk.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much, Peter. And if our listeners want to stay connected with you after they listen to this amazing interview, where can they find you on social media and your website?
You can find me on social media at Peter Marin Works and Peter Marin Artworks. They're both going to lead you to the same place. My website is petermarinartworks.com. And you can always find me every other weekend, all weekend long, in my studio. Studio 105 at Art Space in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina.
Awesome. And as always, we will have all that information in the episode notes below, as well as in our blogs that will be linked in today's show notes, along with episode notes from today's conversation and links to all of our other podcast episodes.
Yep. And if you want to connect with Jackie and I, let us know what you thought about this episode. You can connect with us on social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Or if you want to follow the podcast, we are Level Up Artist on all platforms. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much, Peter. We will talk to you next week.
Great. Thank you so much.